I'll tell you in a second. It'll pop up there. We're going to bounce around a little bit in Genesis because there's one story that covers multiple chapters. So I'm going to give you verses, but it's not going to be all in the same chapter, so we might bounce around a little bit. But what God meant for good. Today we're going to focus on the story of Joseph and his journey. And the goal of this lesson is to show that God's people can forgive those who have caused them to go through hard times for these three reasons. During those hard times, God is still with us, God is still in control, and God is still accomplishing his plan. So even though we're going to talk about the story of Joseph, we're ultimately going to talk about the main story of the Bible, and that's the story of Jesus. In the Old Testament, there were, of course, prophecies about Jesus, but there were also things that were not spoken prophecy, but were foreshadowing prophecy. By foreshadowing, I mean things would happen to people, or maybe certain symbolisms that were supposed to point to something else. In this case, things that would point to Jesus. Now, Joseph is not specifically described as someone who foreshadowed Jesus, but reading the story, you'll see a lot of similarities between them. In Genesis chapter, 22, God had talked to Joseph's great-grandfather, which was Abraham. So Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had Joseph. So Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham. And God told Abraham, he says, listen, I'm going to bless your seed, your offspring, and through your offspring, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. And we know that ultimately the offspring who did bless all the nations of the earth was Jesus. But sometimes in the Old Testament or in the Bible, we see kind of glimpses of a prophecy being fulfilled partially. So, for example, King David, who was a great descendant of Abraham, but King David wanted to build a temple for God. And God said, no, David, you're not going to build me the temple, but your offspring, he will build me a temple, and I will establish an everlasting kingdom with that person. And so we look at that story and we say, okay, well, Solomon built the temple, so did Solomon fulfill that prophecy? Well, kind of. It was a partial fulfillment, but ultimately it pointed forward to Jesus, who God would establish that everlasting kingdom through. So Joseph is another example. He's not someone who was the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that through his offspring, all the nations of the earth would be blessed, but rather he partially fulfilled that, and we'll talk about that today. All right, the story of Joseph. It's a wild story, so buckle up. We're going to go crazy for a second. Now, most of you may know the story of Jacob. Jacob was not a great person, but by God's omniscient wisdom, he decided to choose Jacob just like he had chosen Isaac before him, just as he had chosen Abraham before that. And God chooses Jacob, and Jacob messes up sometimes, just like Abraham did, just like Isaac did, just like everyone does. And Jacob messes up, and he has to flee his home, and he runs away to a land where his mother used to be from, in fact, where Abraham used to be from. And while he's there, he meets this girl, and he gets all googly-eyed, right? All googly-eyed for this girl named Rachel. And so he goes to her father, whose name is Laban, and says, hey, I'd like to marry your daughter. And Laban says, well, if you work for me for 7 years, I'll give you my daughter to marry. And so Jacob works those 7 years, and then Laban tricks Jacob and gives him the older sister, Leah. Now, the problem is Jacob doesn't love Leah, and he's upset with Laban, but Laban says, okay, listen, if you work 7 more years, right, trust me, I'm reliable. If you work 7 more years, I'll give you Rachel, the woman that you actually love. So he works 7 more years, and he marries Rachel, and polygamy, marrying more than one wife, that's got to be difficult. But imagine sisters, that's crazy, right? And you can imagine how crazy that is. And poor Leah is the third wheel to all this romance, right? Jacob and Rachel all the way. Leah's just the third wheel, and she knows she's not loved by her husband. And God decides to show mercy to Leah. The Bible says that God allowed her womb to be open so that she could bear a child. And his name was Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn son of Jacob. So Leah's thinking, sweet, finally I can gain favor with my husband who doesn't love me. He loves my sister, which is probably very annoying. But he's like, at least now he'll love me because I'm producing children for him. So she produces another son. I believe that son was named Simeon. Then a third son. That son was named Levi. Then a fourth son. That son is probably the most popular tribe that we know, Judah, the tribe of Judah, which King David and even Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. So they were a descendant of that son. So she's already produced 4 children, and Rachel is hot, steaming mad because this is competition now. Even though she's loved by Jacob, she's upset because her sister is producing children, and she's not able to produce children. And she confronts Jacob, and Jacob's like, what do you want me to do about it? I'm not God. And this was apparently very common because Rebekah, Jacob's mother, she was also barren. And then Sarah, Jacob's grandmother, was also barren. In each of those cases, God had allowed them to produce children miraculously, and Jacob understood that and said, listen, I have no authority over this. What do you expect me to do? So Rachel tells Jacob, listen, take my servant, marry her, and she will produce children on my behalf, like a surrogate. And we look at that and say that's a bad idea. But apparently that was a common practice back then. Even Sarah, Jacob's grandmother, did that with her servant. So Jacob marries this other girl, not Rachel or Leah, though he's already married to them, and she starts producing children for Rachel. So now there's 6 children, and Leah's like, 2 can play at that game. Take my servant, marry her, and she will bear children on my behalf. So Jacob is one of those people who is constantly in trouble and just can't figure out why, right? And he's like, all right, fine. So he marries the servant of Leah, produces children on behalf of Leah, who has stopped producing children after 4. And now the servant produces 2 more. So you've got 8 at this point. 4 from Leah, 2 from each of the servants. So 4 and 4, that's 8. So they've got 8 children at this point. And then Leah actually has to ask her sister for permission to sleep with her own husband. And eventually she's able to convince Rachel to let her sleep with her own husband, and she produces 2 more children. So now there's 10 children total, and Rachel has had none of them. But God eventually shows mercy to Rachel, and he actually allows her to have children. I guess we should read that, right? And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph. So this was a miracle. She was someone who was barren. She couldn't have children, but God had miraculously allowed her to have children. And of course, we could compare that to the story of Jesus, but that's certainly not the only story where God miraculously allowed someone to have a child. But there's at least a little bit of a comparison there. Now, here's the problem. If you thought competition between these 2 sister wives, as well as their servants, was rough, imagine what it felt like to be the kids of Leah or the kids of one of the servants. And now, finally, the wife who Jacob loves has a child. He's the baby of the family. He's getting all this attention. And you can imagine the children of Leah thinking, my dad doesn't love me. He only loves Rachel and her child. And the servants of Leah or the servants of Rachel thinking, my mom is just a servant. She was just a surrogate for these people, these crazy people. And it says that Israel, which, by the way, Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel. And that's why when we talk about the children of Israel, they are the descendants of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So it says, Israel loved Joseph, which was his 11th born son, the son of Rachel, more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Now, Rachel does actually have a second son, but she dies during childbirth, and that was Benjamin. So Jacob has 12 sons. These 12 sons would eventually become pretty much the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you're wondering why the tribes named after Judah, for example, he was one son of Jacob, and his descendants became an entire tribe. Same for most of the others. Many of you probably grew up in families where you had multiple siblings, or at least more than one sibling. Or maybe you've had kids and you've had multiple kids. Isn't there always this tension between who's the favorite of mom and dad? Now, sometimes this is delusional, or not delusional, but it's made up. Every child is different, and thus the parents respond to them differently. That makes sense, right? If you have a rebellious child and you have to discipline them, it's not because you love the other better. It's just this person's rebellious. But they see that you're not punishing the other person who's not rebellious. And they're like, hey, how come they're not getting punished? In Sunday school the other day, or last week, I talked about how I was just such an angel as a child, but yet I still got spankings for some reason. And I think it was because of this story. My parents were just afraid my siblings were going to hate me if they thought I was so favored. So they spanked me whether I deserved it or not. But no, I do remember getting lots of spankings. I don't remember the crimes, though. But no, I'm sure I deserved it. But the point is, we often look at the other siblings and think, mom loves them more, dad loves them more. And when we feel like, not that they just love them more, but that they're favoring them more, it starts to make us feel like, I got to even the odds, right? If they're getting spoiled, I better unspoil them, right? And I grew up in a family of 10, so there was a lot of sibling rivalries. So Joseph, who didn't ask to be born through Rachel, didn't ask for any of this, he's being favored by his father for different reasons, and his siblings just absolutely despise him for it. We know that Jesus also, when he came unto his own did not receive him, right? The children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Jesus' own people despised him, hated him, rejected him, persecuted him, throughout his ministries. Now, some people did accept him, but as a general rule of thumb, most of them unfortunately rejected him, and that's why he was crucified. Betrayal for the price of a slave. Now, as the hatred of the brothers was kindling against Joseph, they decided to do something about it, and they get him alone, and they take him and they throw him in this deep pit that he can't get out of. And they're questioning, what should we do? And Reuben, the oldest son, if I remember correctly, he goes off somewhere. He's trying to contemplate what to do at this point. And Judah, not the oldest, but again, one of the most famous of the 12 sons, Judah actually said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Then there passed by Midianite merchantmen. These are probably, among them were Ishmaelites, or it may be another name for Ishmaelites, because otherwise this doesn't make sense. Passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now, 20 pieces of silver at that time, we actually have records that reveal that 20 pieces of silver was about the price of a slave, young male slave. And it seems as though Judah, which is ironic, the ancestor of King David, the ancestor of King Jesus, Judah was actually the one who had the idea, let's betray Joseph, let's sell him as a slave, and they sold him for the price of a slave, which at that time was 20 pieces of silver. Ironically, and this is somewhat coincidental, look at what it says about Jesus. Then one of the 12, in this case 12 disciples, not 12 brothers, called Judas, which is Judah, by the way, in Hebrew, Iscariot, went unto the chief priests and said unto them, what will you give me, and I will deliver him unto you? In other words, he was going to betray Jesus. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver, which 30 pieces, Joseph was 20 pieces, but there's inflation, right? I have to imagine 1,000 years of inflation, and it's only that by, 50%? That's pretty good. The American government needs to figure out what they were doing, because 50% increase after 1,000 years is great inflation. But anyway, so at that time, 30 pieces of silver was about the price of a male slave. And from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. So like Joseph, Jesus was betrayed by someone who was one of his own, right? This was one of the 12 who he had chosen as his disciples. And Joseph was betrayed by one of the 12 brothers. Ironically, they had the same name. Now, even though Joseph is sold as a slave, God is not done with Joseph. And the Bible makes it very clear God remains with Joseph and helps him to prosper. In chapter 39, verses 2 through 5, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, whose name was Potiphar. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from that time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field." So even though Joseph is a slave, he's put into this pretty high official in Egypt in his house, and this official, Potiphar, he realizes that God is with this person. Maybe not the gods of Egypt, but some God, in this case the God of Joseph, is behind him, and everything he's doing is prospering. So Potiphar's like, "Hey, how about you do this too?" And he does that too, and it prospers. He's like, "Whoa, how about this?" And he does that, and it prospers. And he's like, "How about you just run everything?" Right? Quite the investment strategist Potiphar was. And Joseph was just blessing, or I should say God was blessing Potiphar through Joseph, because everywhere Joseph went, God was allowing him to prosper. And of course, we know Jesus, God was behind Jesus. And you might think to yourself, but why would God allow Joseph to become a slave? Why would God allow Jesus to become a servant? God has reasons for these things, and as Joseph will later find out, these reasons are big, right? This is going to make a big impact. So God actually allowed Jesus to come to earth to become a servant, and he allowed him to prosper, even to the point where he gained victory over death. Falsely accused. Now Joseph, he continued to prosper in Potiphar's house, and this caught the googly eyes of Potiphar's wife. And she thinks she wants some of Joseph, wants some of that prosperity, and she's like, "Listen, Joseph, you should come with me," right? She's trying to seduce Joseph to sleep with her, and Joseph refuses to do it. He's like, "I'm not going to betray Potiphar," and she gets upset, and she tries to get back at Joseph by falsely accusing him of actually forcing himself on her. So she tells Potiphar this, and now Potiphar, it's unclear if Potiphar believed her or not, but Potiphar has to do something because the accusation is made, so Potiphar decides to throw him in prison. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Now I've heard some speculate that maybe Potiphar knew his wife was lying, so he didn't want Joseph to be killed, or he didn't want to throw him in a common prison for slaves, so he threw him in the prison of the king so that he'd be a little more special treatment. I have no idea if that's the case. All I know is that God was in control, and God put Joseph where he needed to be. So anyways, he is thrown in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph. So even in the prison, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keepers of the prison. And the keepers of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was a doer of it. So like Potiphar, these prison guards start to realize that everything that Joseph is assigned begins to prosper. And I don't know how long it took, but eventually they just said, "Joseph, you're in charge of everything, right? We want everything to work out well." So now Joseph is pretty much the warden, even though he's a prisoner. He's the warden of the prison. And while he's there, I guess we should go on to the comparison with Jesus first. We know that like Joseph, Jesus was falsely accused of by people, and he was actually in prison for it. And we know that Peter sees this as an injustice as they're coming to arrest Jesus after he's been betrayed, that he pulls out a sword and he starts trying to whack off ears, right? And Jesus tells Peter to put his sword away, and he reveals to Peter, "This is why I'm here." Right now, Joseph, I don't know when he figured this out, that God was setting these things up. We know eventually he does figure that out. But I would have to assume that at the time, Joseph doesn't know what's going on. When he's being sold as a slave, he didn't know God was behind that. When he was being accused of by Potiphar's wife and thrown in prison, he didn't understand that, what was going on. But Jesus understood. He said, God's going to do something amazing out of this. So he tells Peter, put your sword away. This is the will of God. Now, while Joseph is in prison, he actually meets two people. And again, this is the king's prison. So the people who would be here are people who work for the king. And one was a butler and a baker and a candlestick maker. No, I'm just kidding. That's a rhyme. I don't know where it's from. But one was a butler and one was a baker. And the butler and the baker, they both have dreams. Now, something that's actually unique in the Old Testament is prophets. It's unique to the Hebrews. Most other countries didn't believe in prophets, or at least they didn't claim to have prophets. What they had were people who could read signs and omens. So not that they necessarily knew how to do it, but at least they claimed to know how to do it. So the people were always looking for good omens or bad omens, and sometimes this was through dreams. So the butler and the baker, they have these dreams, and they're confused, they're perplexed. They feel like these dreams have meaning to them, and I don't believe every dream has meaning, but these apparently did. And Joseph, who has actually been able to interpret dreams in the past, he goes to them and he says, here, tell me what your dreams are. And when they tell him their dreams, he reveals to them that one of them is actually going to be sent back to the king, and he's going to serve the king as the butler again. The other, unfortunately, was going to be killed. And when these things were coming to pass, Joseph tells the butler, the one who's going back to the king, remember me when you go to the king. And unfortunately, for about 2 years, the butler does not apparently mention Joseph to the king until the king himself, the king of Egypt, has a dream, and he's troubled by this dream. He's starting to think maybe there's meaning to this dream. Maybe it's a good omen, maybe it's a bad omen. There were parts of the dream that seemed really good. There were parts that seemed really bad. And he brings, I guess let's read it. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit, this is the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians in Egypt and all the wise men thereof, right? He wants someone who is a diviner, someone who can interpret these omens. But there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, and he talks about how he was imprisoned at one point, and there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dream. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. So Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt, his butler is telling him, I know someone who can interpret dreams. So Pharaoh, he goes and he gets Joseph out of the prison, and he says, hey, I hear you can interpret dreams. And Joseph's like, I cannot, but God can. Tell me what your dream is. So Potiphar tells him his dream. What's the next part? We can see that even with Jesus, for example, the things that he had told them, the things that he said that after 3 days I'll rise from the dead, they had actually forgotten about it until later on. But Joseph promoted. So anyway, so the king takes Joseph. Joseph interprets the dream, and the dream basically was interpreted to mean that 7 years Egypt will go through a lot of prosperity. The fields will be ripe. You'll have an overabundance of food in Egypt. He says, but following this 7 years of prosperity will be 7 years of famine. Can you imagine 7 years of famine? And Joseph tells the king, he says, listen, you need to appoint somebody over this task to set aside food during the 7 years of prosperity so that during the 7 years of famine, Egypt can survive, because otherwise they're going to die. And of course, the king is impressed by Joseph, and he thinks, who better to do this than you? And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. So just like Potiphar, who saw God blessing Joseph and blessing everything that he did, he was like, listen, I want you in charge of everything that's mine. And then the prison guards, seeing that God was blessing Joseph, said, listen, I want you in charge of over everything. And now the king of Egypt sees Joseph and says, I want you in charge of everything. The only person who has more authority than you in Egypt is myself, the king. So Joseph is greatly promoted, and he actually he does accomplish this task. He is able to save enough food, not just to help Egypt survive the 7 years, but this famine was throughout perhaps the whole earth. So that all the surrounding nations were unprepared for this. So when the famine actually came, they started going to Egypt to find food because Egypt was the only one prepared for the famine because Joseph was there and God used Joseph to help Egypt prepare. Now, the problem with this famine is it didn't just impact, again, Egypt. It impacted all the nations, including the land that Jacob and his family were at. So Jacob, at this point, he thinks Joseph is dead. His sons lied to him, told them that wolves ate him. So Jacob is not expecting Joseph or anybody like that. But he tells 10 of his sons, he keeps Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, the youngest son, keeps him behind, but he sends his other sons to Egypt and says, there's food in Egypt, go to Egypt, buy some food, and bring it home so that we can survive. So his sons go to Egypt, and you have to remember, Joseph was only 17 years old when he was sold as a slave. And so he's a full-grown man, he's a parent. Jacob is an old man, well over 100 years old. And have you guys ever seen that cartoon? I think it's a DreamWorks cartoon about Joseph. It's like Joseph something of dreams. I can't remember what the name is. But in that movie, it shows Benjamin like he's just a young child. Benjamin was a parent, right? He's already a full-grown adult. So a long time has already passed, at least 14 years, because of the 7 years of famine, 7 years of prosperity, and however long he was in prison. So Joseph is already much older, and his brothers don't recognize him when they see him. Now, again, this makes sense. He's older. He's dressed as an Egyptian now. He probably has different grooming habits. But he recognizes his brothers, and this overwhelms him. And the Bible says he actually has to get away and hide because he's so overwhelmed with emotions seeing his brothers again after all these years, the brothers who had betrayed him. And instead of revealing himself to them, he actually sends them through some tests. It's kind of clear why he does this. He seems to want to see if they've changed. And the test basically included this idea of, will they protect Benjamin? Remember, they hated Joseph. Joseph was the baby of the family until Benjamin got there. He was the son, or the firstborn son of Rachel, the wife that Jacob loved, and they hated him for it, and they sold him as a slave. Would they do the same thing to Benjamin, his younger brother? So he gives them this test. They still don't know who he is, but basically he tricks them into thinking he's going to punish Benjamin, and I believe it's Judah. The brothers, they step up and they protect Benjamin, and this overwhelms Joseph with emotion again, seeing that his brothers have changed, seeing that they'll stand up for his younger brother, their younger brother too. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, "Cause every man to go out from me." And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren, and he wept aloud. In fact, it says he wept so loud that all the people in the house of the king of Egypt could hear his weeping. And Joseph said unto his brethren, "I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?" Remember, he loves his father. His father loves him. His father thinks he's dead. Jacob, at this point, is a super old guy, 100 years old. In fact, I won't spoil it yet. But Joseph is asking, is my father still alive? He knows Benjamin's alive. Benjamin's there. And the brothers, they seem confused. They seem shocked. What's going on? And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life." So Jacob gives them this forgiveness, this automatic forgiveness, even though they hadn't necessarily reconciled, they hadn't apologized to him, but he sees something in them, and he recognizes this was all God's plan, right? You guys played a terrible part, but this was God's doing. God allowed you to sell me as a slave so that I would be here in this position. I'm in the place of God where he wants me to be so that I could preserve life. Because if Joseph was not in Egypt, he could not have warned Egypt about the coming famine. If he had not warned Egypt about the coming famine, they would not have been prepared for it. Egypt would have passed away. All the surrounding nations, including Jacob's family, would have died during the 7-year famine if Joseph was not sold as a slave. And Joseph recognizes this and he says, listen, I was put here by God for this reason, to preserve life. Where am I? Again, we know that God had told Abraham over 100 years prior to this that through his seed, one of his offspring, he was going to bless all the nations of the earth. And Joseph certainly fits that to some extent, but we know that ultimately it was pushing forward to Jesus. Jesus would be the one who blessed all the nations, because even though Joseph was used to preserve Egypt, to preserve his parents, his family, to preserve all the surrounding nations from the death of the famine, God sent Jesus that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So even though Joseph preserved life, Jesus provided eternal life through his suffering. Now, Jacob, he hears that Joseph is alive and he's ecstatic, and he decides, of course, there's a famine in his land. There's no food there. He's like, let's move to Egypt. So if you're wondering why were the children of Israel in Egypt by the time Moses came, that's why. They moved to Egypt, Jacob and his family. And his family was huge at this point. He's got his 12 sons who all have children, all have wives, all have servants. There's a bunch of them, and they move to Egypt. And the king of Egypt, who loves Joseph, now loves Jacob. And he's like, you're super old, dude. And he's like, if you think I'm old, you should have seen my father Isaac. He lived to like 140. And the king's like, wow. And he's like, you should have heard about my grandfather, Abraham. He was like 160. He's like, wow. Right? And I don't know why the Bible records that, but it does. He was ecstatic about how old Jacob was. In fact, Jacob, when he eventually dies, the king of Egypt sends this giant caravan to bring him back to the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel, where he could be buried. And the caravan was so big because all of Egypt wanted to honor Jacob, this father of Joseph, the person who preserved their life. This old person who lived so long was blessed by God, and that even the people, as they saw the caravan, these random strangers in these lands, they were like, whoever this person was a great person. But anyways, after Jacob dies, the brothers are a little curious. Have you guys ever forgiven someone and then something happened and that bitterness and anger comes back up, and you're like, I thought I forgave this person. Now I just want to punch him in the face. It depends on the crime, right? But anyways, shouldn't punch people in the face. The brothers, they were curious, is Joseph going to continue to extend his forgiveness? Because forgiveness is not always a one-time event, but a continual choice. Every day you have to continue to choose, I will not hold that against them. I will not hold that against them. And they were curious, now that Jacob was dead, was he going to remove that choice, right? He was no longer going to forgive them. And they came to him asking him this question. And listen to what he says. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for I am in the place of God, right? I'm where God intended for me to be. But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. So Joseph is telling his brothers, I'm forgiving you, not because what you did was small, not because you reconciled with me, not because I just don't want to be bitter. Though all those things may be good points, Joseph reveals the reason why I can forgive you is because I recognize this was all part of God's plan. What you intended for evil, what you meant to hurt me, God meant for good. He meant to preserve life through it. So Joseph was able to forgive them, again, not because he lost his bitterness, not because they reconciled with him, but because he understood this was God's plan, and otherwise these great things would not have happened. And I guess we should talk about Jesus, of course. The Bible says God sent not his son into the world to condemn the world, right, to judge the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Jesus himself came as a sacrifice for us, not to judge us, but to save us. And Jesus understood, again, when Peter was trying to stop what was going on, he was trying to stop his master from being taken captive, where he was going to be beaten, where he was going to be mocked, where he was going to be falsely accused, where he was going to be whipped, where he was going to have a crown of thorns smashed on his head, where he was going to be stripped naked and humiliated as he's hung on a cross, nails through his hands. And Peter's trying to stop all this, and Jesus says, this is why I'm here. I've come here for this reason. And yet on that cross, knowing that even though what they are intending for evil, what they're intending to hurt Jesus, Jesus understands this is part of God's plan. God's doing something amazing through this. And with that knowledge, Jesus can cry out saying, Father, right, Dad, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So like Joseph, Jesus understood God is behind this. Apparently he didn't like the way it was going to happen, but he understood this is necessary to reach what God is trying to do in my life. And I would encourage you, because I'm going to care to guess that Joseph, when he was being sold as a slave, he didn't understand that this was part of God's plan. Maybe when he was prospering in Potiphar's house, he thought, oh, well, maybe God's still with me. But then he was falsely accused and terrible things happened. He was thrown in prison. And I would care to guess he's probably thinking, I don't understand how this is part of God's plan. But then he prospered in prison. And then he was eventually taken out of prison and promoted to basically the leader of Egypt other than the king. And at some point, Joseph realizes this was all part of God's plan. God allowed my suffering to happen for a reason. And he was able to use that knowledge to forgive his brothers for what they had done to him. And that's why I want to argue today in the conclusion, God's people can forgive those who have caused them hard times for these 3 reasons. Even in the hard times, God is still with us. He never abandoned Joseph. But the thing is, God wasn't just reacting to the situations. It wasn't like God was a passenger in this story where Joseph was taken in slavery. He's like, oh, wow, I didn't know this was going to happen. I guess I'll help him prosper here. And then he was accused and thrown in prison. He's like, whoa, I didn't know this was going to happen. No, God was in control of the situations, and God was using this situation for good. So what they meant for evil, God meant for good. And I want to encourage you, because everybody has gone through times of pain in their life. Sometimes this pain is caused by accident. Sometimes it's caused intentionally. And it may be your spouse hurt you. Maybe it ended in divorce. It may be that your best friend betrayed you, or just another friend. It might be that your siblings hurt you, or your parents hurt you, or maybe your children hurt you, or your coworkers hurt you, or your boss hurt you, or somebody has done something to you that has caused you a tremendous amount of pain in your life. And you're thinking to yourself, how can I forgive that? And when we're in the midst of the pain, it's like we're in a fog. Imagine going up a mountain and you're in a foggy area, and eventually you get so high up that you can see right over the fog, and suddenly you see the beauty of where God was bringing you. It didn't make sense during the fog. It didn't make sense when your legs were tired trying to climb up a mountain you can barely see. But as you finally got to it, you can look back and see what God was doing. And that's what Joseph did. He saw that God was doing something amazing through the trials in his life, and because of that, he was able to forgive those who were part of the process to get him there. And again, I want to encourage you to do the same thing. Think back in your life, and some of you can actually see the good that came out of your life. I can think of my sister who passed away to suicide, and of course it was a difficult time for me, and it was a difficult time for my family. And at the time, I wasn't really angry at God. It's hard to be angry at her because, right, you miss her. You're not like, oh, I hate you. You're just thinking how much you miss her. But it was her fault. It was suicide. But there was so much mixed emotions on it. Wasn't angry at God. I was just sad. And it was hard to understand how that was going to lead to anything good. And though certainly I do wish my sister was still here, God has brought people into my life who are also contemplating things like suicide. We're also contemplating, we're going through depression, we're going through difficult times in their life, and they came to me, not because I'm some brilliant person, but they said, Daniel, you have experience in this area. I know your sister did this, or when you went through times of trouble, you handled it so well, and I was able to point them to Jesus and say, it wasn't because I was such a great guy. It was because God helped me through these trials. So God was able to use this terrible thing that happened for good, and I don't even know how much good it will cause because my story isn't over. The story of those affected isn't over. So you might think You know, when you were fired by that job, you might be able to look back and say, you know, I hated that I was fired. I hated that I had to go through all this pain of uncertainty. How was I going to pay my bills? But now I have an even better job. And you can look at that and say, you know, that worked out for the best. But sometimes it's not clear to us. And in those times when it's not clear, that's when we need faith in God the most, to understand that, hey, you're still with me, you're still in control, and you're still doing something wonderful out of this. This is part of your plan. And whoever you brought into my life, whoever pushed me in these different directions, I can forgive all of them, knowing that. Let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I want to thank you for this day. Lord, I know each and every one of us have gone through hard times. And Lord, for most of the world, especially atheists, I suppose, hard times are confusing, because for them, it has no purpose other than just to hurt them. But within Christianity, we realize that pain and suffering have a purpose. Jesus himself went through the pain and the suffering because it was necessary for what had to happen. We can go through times of our own suffering, not understanding, but trusting you, Lord, that you're doing something beautiful out of this. Lord, I know that there's going to be people in our lives, or maybe there's already been, who have hurt us, and it's going to be hard to forgive them. But Lord, may we forgive them, not just for their sake, not even just for our sake, but for your sake, for your testimony, Lord. Because if we can demonstrate to the world that we have such peace, knowing that our God is in control, what kind of a testimony will that be to the world? Lord, I pray that you would give us hearts of understanding, hearts of faith, that during those difficult times we would continue to trust you. Lord, we love you.